Okay, so we're going to focus today on characteristics of romantic painting. And the first theme that we have is war and violence. War and violence. So you remember that our theme for this unit, so we're really talking about like 18th, 19th century art, is enlightenment and revolution, head versus heart. So we already spent time classifying neoclassicism, and neoclassicism is rooted in the enlightenment and it's rooted in the head, right? So now we're going to move to the other side. We're going to look at romantic painting, as well as romantic, excuse me, excuse me. We'll be looking at romantic painting primarily. I apologize. And then when we're looking at the inspiration, there's a lot of value in intuition, right? Sort of following how you feel, following your emotions and your imagination. A lot of the inspiration for this work is medieval, Baroque, imagery that comes from distant, far off lands, places where they colonized. So they look at things like Asia and the Middle East and Africa. And then there's also kind of a revolution of nature. And so we'll actually see one painting today, like in this first theme with nature, but then the second half of our discussion today will be on landscape. So we'll see kind of landscape becoming really popular during this time. The tone is very subjective, spontaneous, and nonconformist. Subject matter is often contemporary events. So we're going to see a lot of contemporary event paintings today, as well as violent imagery, because of course our theme for the first half is war and violence, but also exotic locations, nature, legend, and stories that come from the medieval period. Subject matter, color is unrestrained. It typically is very rich. So you'll see brighter colors, more vivid, rich yellows, rich blues, rich reds, and so on. The technique, you often see a lot of mark making. So remember that these are like the Poussinists for the Academy. So they're very much into expressive brushstroke, and the color and the emotional qualities of it. And then in the compositions, they often use diagonals to be more dramatic, because verticals are very stoic and horizontals are very calming, right? So diagonals are just stronger. So in romantic characteristics in literature and music, it often celebrates the individual. The name actually comes from novellas and stories and poems from the Romantic languages. Often this is where we see like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Dracula. We have these very dramatic stories being written during this time, and they're often looking to the Gothic past. It's still based on the Enlightenment. They're liberated through thought. They embrace their emotion. They're revolting against reality. They're escaping from hardship. I keep hearing the equivalent of what happened when we had the Spanish flu in 1919, and then we had the Roaring 20s. So a lot of people are thinking like after this current pandemic, probably going to have like a upswing and everything, and everyone's going to be all joyous and dancing. We might see an explosion in commerce. So that kind of feeling is what was happening here. Rebelling against reason, it's the age of sensibility. Temperament shows a trend in revolt against order and religion. They're really rebelling against the establishment. So established power, so monarchy, established religion, so like Catholic Church or even Protestant Church at this point. Return to worship of nature, worship beliefs of liberty, power of love, violence. This is not necessarily just an art style, it's kind of a philosophy. And we often see a shift in patronage during this time. So it's moving away from royalty and state commissions to paintings made for the bourgeoisie. Okay, so our first artist today is a Spaniard, and it's Francisco Goya, right? And when you're looking at this print, right, he made a lot of prints too. Um, Anyone have any idea what he's dreaming about, or at least the mood of his dream?
Like nightmares?
Exactly, and I believe, let me get the title of this one for you. The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. That is the name of this one. And so it is this just like this nightmarish scene. And so when you look into the background, his head is covered, he's sleeping, but then behind him are all these owls and bats, and they are just things of his nightmares. And so this was done after the reinstatement of Charles IV. And it was one of 80 etchings that he made based on the follies of Spanish life. And so when we look at his art today, we're going to notice that he makes a lot of pointed commentaries towards the established government of Spain. And he hopes that through his art, people are going to kind of wake up and be able to see the errors of their ways. So he was a court painter. So just like Velasquez before him, Goya started off as a court painter, and here he's painting the Habsburgs. When you look at this painting and kind of compare them, you can see that there's a lot of similarities, right? So remember Las Niñas, right? Who do you think is over here in the shadow? Who's this guy?
The artist of the painting?
Exactly, the artist of the painting. So there's Goya hanging out behind this really large painting. Could be this one being painted as well. It's got paintings in the background. He uses interesting shadow on top of the feature, or on top of some of the people, kind of blocking people out. But in a way, he's kind of showing the true nature. Even though he works for the monarchy, look at some of these faces. They're not necessarily idealized. Grandma has a big mole on her head. Maybe it's that mark of syphilis that we saw when we looked at our British paintings. We see kind of this Habsburgs, they did a lot of intermarrying, so they had a lot of similar facial features. So they're not really shown in the best light possible. And so he has kind of that wispy sort of brushstroke that we see of the Rococo, right? So that's in his paintings. Now, the artwork that we have in the 250 is All There's Nothing to Be Done, and it's from the disasters of war. So he made a series of prints based on what happens with warfare. Okay, so what I'm going to do is put you guys into 3 groups, and for this breakout, I'm only going to give you like 3 minutes in the breakout room. It's not going to take very long. What I want you guys to do is I want you to turn on your camera so you can see each other if possible. If there's an issue and you can't, that's one thing. And all I want you to do is to focus on, so group 1, so that's going to be Cora, Jasmine, Katie, and Quana. I want you guys to focus on what's in the foreground. So foreground is what's in the front. And I want you guys to have a discussion about what's in the front. Group 2 is going to focus on the middle ground, right? The middle ground. So that's what's kind of behind this person in the center, right? So that's going to be Emily, Isabel, Eva, and Rahil. And then background, the thing that's farthest from you, is going to be group 3. And that's going to be Alana, Jeffrey, Isabella, and Varun. Okay, so you guys know what you're going to do? I want you to talk through what are all the things you see in foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay, I'm opening the rooms. I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. Hey, Suri, set a timer for 3 minutes. Okay, group one. So Cora, Jasmine, Katie, Quana, right? What's in the foreground? So what's in the front? Let's focus on the content. When it comes to your note takers, that's what you're focusing on is what is the content right now. So go ahead, Cora, Jasmine, Katie, Quana. What'd you guys talk about?
I thought the dead man laying on the ground, like his face, is definitely in the foreground.
Right. So I love the fact that you brought up his face. So instead of it being like an anonymous person, you really see the face of the individual, right? Because war is real and it kills real people, right? Is there anything else in the foreground?
On the right side, there are the ends of guns sticking out.
Exactly. There are some rifles there on the right side. And that definitely is something that many people fail to see, right? Is that there's these very dramatic rifles. Anything else in the front? Did you guys talk about this guy here in the very center? Or did you guys talk about that for middle ground? In the Emily, Isabel, Eva, Raheel? I'd probably say that this is foreground in front, kind of this line of the landscape, kind of is everything that's in the front. And so we have this man here. And so what's happening to him? Somebody in group one, maybe Katie.
He's tied up to a pole and blindfolded.
Exactly. And so you think he's about to be executed by the people holding the rifles that you can't see, right? This kind of foreign entity. So then middle ground. So Emily, Isabel, Eva, and Raheel, what's in the middle ground? It really does inform the foreground for us.
We kind of talked about how it's like a repeat of the foreground, and like how there's another man in the background tied up and he's being executed.
Okay, so if we think about wars, this isolated incident, it's not just happening to one person or two people, it's happening to a bunch of people. And you can see that there are two people here, but then other things are hidden by the guy in the front and the soldiers. So it leads you to think, is there more people hidden behind the soldiers, right? So like, how much of a mass killing is this of revolutionaries or people who don't agree with the government, or the opposing side? So yeah, so you see soldiers, right? And you see the captured. And then background, this might be interesting. What's in the background? So Alana and Jeffrey and Isabella and Varun.
We said that there really isn't too much, but we noticed how there's like an extra hill, it seems like in the background, and then like the light almost seems like some kind of like a sunset or like a sunrise or something like that.
Mhm.
So
It's got that kind of Baroque dramatic lighting where it's very dark and very light. And so it has a little bit of atmospheric perspective. So this hill gets lighter, like you mentioned, and then there's that essence of light there. So maybe that's a symbol of hope, right? Or maybe it's just some drama, right? Because that sky over here is really dark. And being that this is a print, right? We're not quite sure exactly what that is, but that could be fire, like smoke caused by fire or destruction, or that could be a storm, right? And so it could be also very symbolic of warfare. Good. And so we'll just look at kind of these close-ups here of what's in the foreground. So he's using etching, and you can see how he's shading with little lines cut into the metal, all right? And so here he's giving us a real full story about what happens with warfare. Now, he would have known about the prints by like people like Rembrandt. And so this very dramatic lighting of light and dark, and he used that drama, right? Notice how light the people are and how dark the background is, so that you really notice all that kind of poignant moments of the dead, of those who are about to be shot, and then the soldiers. Right? So function for this. This is one of a series, like I mentioned, based on the disasters of war, and it's based on the French occupation of Spain by Napoleon. So Napoleon basically said he came into Spain saying that he was going to go in and conquer Portugal. He goes, can I come through and conquer Portugal? And he instead turns and he basically ousts the Spanish king. He tricks the Spanish king, Charles IV, and allows French troops to come into Spain. And then Napoleon lets his brother Joseph become ruler of Spain. So this is a French takeover of Spain. And so, of course, the Spanish, right, were kind of distraught about being taken over by the French. And so a lot of Spanish citizens revolted against them, and the French went in and slaughtered a lot of these people. So it really shows Goya's political views. Now, one of the things to note is that this was not necessarily a contemporary print series. He made them during the revolt and after, slightly after the revolt, but he didn't necessarily show them until decades after, right? And one of the reasons is that he feared for his life, right? He, could have been killed himself, and so it wasn't shown until much later. Right? So notice that this person in the front is basically a symbol of the common man, right? The common man. And how is he emphasized? We talked about the lighting already, right? But he's given a very kind of Christ-like status, right? Often see during this time that man is portrayed like Christ. And so notice how instead of being on a crucifix, right, he's tied to a post, and he's, kind of displayed in a very heroic sort of way, right? That he's sacrificing himself for the cause, right? He's sacrificing himself for his patriotism to Spain. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so here are some of those romantic characteristics, right? It's based on current events. It's based on his political views. 35 years after his death, they were actually shown. So they're based on liberty, very dramatic lighting, based on emotion, nonconformist, semi-contemporary events, violent imagery, and then we have some diagonals in this imagery. I wouldn't say it's all diagonals. I actually think there's a lot of verticals and horizontals as well, but it definitely has those other things as well. The 4th of May, this is another scene of the revolution. This is one of his more famous paintings, very similar to the one we just mentioned. So notice how the common man here, once again, very Christ-like, bright white shirt, arms stretched out, almost like a crucifix, right? And then we see the destruction caused by the French. So here's some more examples of those prints from the Disasters of War series. He, is very trained. And so just like Michelangelo was, basing imagery over Vatican collections, so too was Goya. Look at more rifles, more guns. You see that's kind of a common motif of kind of just sneaking in the rifles. Towards the end of his life, Goya was going deaf, and he painted a series of paintings inside his house in Madrid. This one is on a door. This is Saturn devouring his son. Kind of gruesome, right? How do you think he felt about becoming deaf? Alana, what do you think? How do you think he felt?
Scared, not good.
Exactly. He was definitely scared. He was very traumatized by it, and he really felt like he couldn't he couldn't understand and he couldn't trust people. So people really look like monsters, right? So the next image we have is by Jericho, and he's not in the 250, but this is probably one of the most famous romantic paintings. And so this is based on a capsized ship. So the ship was transporting people from France to Morocco. So an exotic location. They were moving to Morocco to start a new life, or excuse me, maybe it was Tanzania. Anyway, they were going somewhere exotic and their ship capsized. And this would have been something that people would have read about and been obsessed about in the newspapers. And so what basically happened is hundreds of people died. Very few people, I think like 13 people survived. And so Jericho went through and made a bunch of different sketches to make sure that he got the most dramatic composition. And he, played with lighting, he played with configurations, even went to the morgue. And so these are studies of arms and legs from the morgue because he wanted to make sure that he was able to portray death. And so in this scene, there's a series of diagonals. So if you start with the bottom left, we've got dead bodies, and then people are kind of sitting, and then they're on their knees, and then they're almost standing, and then kind of reaching up here. So this person at the very top is looking off. And if you really look far here, there's a ship in the horizon. So there's this essence of hope in the horizon here. So this was supposed to be inspirational, but also kind of based on this tragic scene where I think some people were reduced to cannibalism as well. So once again, contemporary events. Here's some Jericho prints based on the poor. Right here is by a bakery, but they won't give the grizzly old man, anything to support him. And this was made through lithography. We'll talk more about lithography later. So these are Jericho paintings. This is Jacques Louis David. So if you remember the guy, Otho Horatio guy, remember how he worked for the monarchy, then he worked for the revolution with the death of Marat, and then he worked again for Napoleon. He was always kind of with whoever was in power. And so this is basically him kind of as Hannibal crossing the Alps. And then this is Delacroix. And so Delacroix does a lot of scenes based on exotic locations. So I think this is based on the Middle East, if I remember, a Syrian prince and his harem. So this is a portrait of Chopin by Delacroix, right? And that leads us to Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix. Okay, so the event. This is the July Revolution of 1830. It was like a revolution that only lasted about a month. So this is not like the first major, ours was in 1876, 1878, I think was the first major French Revolution. So this one is much later, so 1830. And how does Delacroix capture that moment? Right? How is he capturing that moment? Kind of focus on describing it, right? So first things first, notice how large it is. This is in the Louvre. This is side by side in the same gallery as that Delacroix or that Jericho that we just saw, the Raft of Medusa. And then the Otho Horatio is like a few paintings down as well. So this is a very large painting. And so it's kind of like a history painting of a contemporary event. So it's really, really large, right? So let's go ahead and focus on telling the story. So instead of breaking up in groups again, let's go ahead and do that foreground, middle ground, background. And I want to kind of stand here first for a second. Since we're going to start in the foreground, we're going to start at the bottom of the painting. And I want to point out to you that just like Baroque painting, right? Delacroix is putting the activity closest to the viewer, right? He's kind of bringing things up front and really having you notice the horrors of war and revolution, right? So what do we have at eye level? When you go to the Louvre and you're staring at this painting, what's going to be right in your face at the bottom of this painting? Jeffrey, what do you think? What's at the very base?
There's like what looks like a bunch of dead bodies.
Right. So these are revolutionaries who have given up their life for the cause of this 1830 revolution. Right. So these are the brothers, the cousins, the patriots. Right. These are the friends, right, of all of these people behind, the compadres, right? So we have the foreground, we see the destruction. And if you look really carefully, you can see that there is some barricades that were built, right? So there's stone kind of fencing, and that was built by the government, right, to keep the revolutionaries out. So they're coming over this wall, right, this barricade. And so then let's look at the people kind of in the middle ground here, right? What are they doing? They are going over the barricade, right? They're going over the barricade. And if I look at these people, let's focus on these people on the left first, right? Do they appear to be in the same social class? The guy with the saber, the sword, and the guy with the rifle. Do they look like they're the same social class? No. Thank you for shaking your heads. That's great. I'm just really glad that you guys are participating. That's good. So yeah, they're different social classes. So they're all coming together for a common good for the cause, right? So we have probably a upper middle class man in a top hat. And then we probably have a lower class worker, right, on the left. And if we go to the far right, we actually can see the youth too, right? We see the youth. And then we have this person in the very center. Of course, it's called Liberty Leading the People. So that must be Liberty there. And then we see a bunch of different people in the background. We see soldiers. So we actually see a French soldier. We see a bunch of other people from different classes. And then far into the distance, you see either smoke or clouds, and you see the Parisian landscape. So there's Notre Dame in the background, and that would be connected with the church and connected with the monarchy. So there's a symbol of the monarchy through the smoke, right? So let's focus on, right? Focus on who she is, right? How is she not a real woman, and how do we know? How do we know this is not a real woman? Eva, do you have any guesses about how I know she's not a real woman? Eva, are you there? She looks frozen. Can anyone help Eva out? How about Isabella? Can you help out? How is she not a real woman? Think about the situation that she's a part of.
Well, it kind of looks like she's like allegorical. It looks like she's like urging the people forward.
Right. She's a symbol of liberty. She's half nude, right? She's half nude. So a real woman would not be in a war half nude, right? Especially around all those men. So she is the personification of liberty. She's the personification of French liberty and French Revolution. She actually has this Phrygian cap on, which is a signifier of peace. So she's wearing this hat that signifies peace as well. She's actually based on maybe like the Venus of Aphrodite, or so this was something that was in the French collection, right? That is actually at the Louvre today. right? And so thinking about its romantic characteristics, right, is it's very passionate, it's very emotional, it's based on contemporary events, right? It's nonconformist, because remember, they're revolting against the French government in this image. The subject matter is contemporary, but it's also violent. It's got that strong color. Look how rich the red is, right? Look how light the sky is, how dark the blue is, how dark some of this detail is around it. So there's that contrast between light and dark. It's got expressive brushstroke, especially in the background, right? And then it has a lot more diagonals than we saw in the Goya. So here's another Delacroix. This is a lion hunt. Okay, so our last subject for today is to look at landscape and how it is characteristic of the Romantic period. We're going to see how man relates to nature. So this is by Frederick, oh my goodness, Caspar David Frederick. He's trying to make it into his first name. I apologize for that, right? And so this is a landscape painting. How is it romantic? Any ideas how this is romantic? It doesn't have lots of romantic characteristics to it, but any ideas how it's romantic? Can you guys even tell what's going on? It's kind of mysterious in a way, right? If you look really carefully in the fog, and that's what this is actually called, it's nebel, which is fog, there is a ship, right? So you can barely make it out with the atmospheric perspective. And there's the little buoy coming into harbor. So it's kind of like coming into this exotic location. He did images of the Arctic explorations that were starting to take place during this time. This is actually based on a capsized ship. You actually can see the ship right there that got caught in an iceberg. So nature is very powerful. It's very mysterious, right? It impedes what we can see. It can destroy. And that's very characteristic. He did a lot of imagery based on Gothic architecture. And so you can see how the Gothic architecture is kind of deteriorated, right? And it's got that dramatic light and dark. So everything is kind of based on like death and destruction. There's a cemetery, there's trees without leaves, and then there's like these shells of Gothic churches that are left, right? This is Joseph Mallord Willard Turner, and he is known for his landscapes. And this one is Hannibal crossing the Alps. Can you even tell where Hannibal is? The painting really appears to be about the sky, and we see some people here, but Hannibal really is right back here under this little oval, right? So it's really like small in comparison to this very stormy sky. So Turner painted some of those scenes of the fire that we saw yesterday. So remember that the old palace burned down. And so in that location, they rebuilt the British Parliament. And so here you can see the destruction. He's really known for kind of these violent scenes of it. So number 111 is Slave Ship, which is also known as Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming, by Joseph Mallord William Turner, which I always think is like the artist with the longest name ever. Of course, Picasso had like 13 names. We'll talk about that later. So let's go ahead and look at the video. And when we're looking at the video, what I'd like you guys to focus on is how it's romantic. So when I say how is it romantic, let's not just focus on the technique. Let's think about the subject matter, the mood, the tone, all of those components.
We're standing in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, in front of what we know as Turner's Slave Ship. But the full title of this work is Slave Ship, slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, Typhoon coming on.
You know, when we first come across this painting, it looks really beautiful. It's got oranges and reds, and we see that typical Turner sunset. We're lost in the thick sensuality of the paint.
But then my eye goes to the bottom right-hand corner, and in a moment of horror, I see a foot and a leg and a shackle and chains. And all of a sudden, it's not a seascape, and it's not about a sunset, and it's not about light on the water, or not only about those things anymore.
There's real carnage right in front of us. In fact, in the closest part of the painting towards us. So we're looking at an image of a slave ship that we can see in the distance. This is a ship carrying slaves, and a typhoon has come on. This is based on a poem, but we know that this is something that happened in reality, and not just once, but many times. With the storm coming, the captain of the ship decided to throw the slaves overboard. Apparently, that was the only way you could collect the insurance. If the slaves died of illness or other things while on board, the captain of the ship couldn't claim insurance. So what he's done is he's thrown the slaves overboard, and that's what we see happening.
It is really horrifying. We only see parts of their bodies, and there's a swirl of waves and colors. And again, there's this mixture of the beauty of nature, the power of nature, and this horrific human act that is within the context of a much wider horrific human act of slavery.
We do have this sense of divine retribution, the storm coming for that slave ship that's been dealing in human lives, and the punishment wreaked by nature is justified on that ship. But there's also a sense of the total indifference of nature, because the same storm that's going to overcome that slave ship is also going to drown the slaves themselves.
Nature is completely indifferent to the human endeavors, whether they are good, evil, otherwise, whatever.
So the first owner of this painting was the great Victorian art critic John Ruskin. Then the painting made its way to Boston to an abolitionist, to someone who believed in and struggled for the ending of slavery. Now, the British had outlawed slavery in 1833 in the colonies. The French do it in their colonies 15 years later. But of course, in America, slavery isn't outlawed until the Civil War. So slavery, we have to remember, is still a really active political cause at this moment. This idea that human beings could do this to each other, not just in the form of actual slavery, of buying and selling human beings, but also in terms of taking advantage of one another just for the sake of money. And of course, that's the kernel of this hideous act that the captain engages in here.
When we look into the left border of the painting, we see some really different colors than what we see in the rest of the painting. Whites and blues and purples and grays.
Ruskin wrote, "Purple and blue, the lurid shadows of the hollow breakers are cast upon the mist of night, which gathers cold and low, advancing like the shallow of death upon the guilty ship, as it labors amidst the lightning of the sea, its thin masts written upon the sky in lines of blood."
Okay, so let's go ahead and focus on how it is romantic. So what are some of those characteristics that you guys saw? What are some of those characteristics? How about Emily? Can you give me one?
I guess like the use of like the colors.
Right. So the colors are, we think about, use of colors. What kind of colors are they using? What do you think, Emily? Can you describe them a little bit more?
It's like a wide like range, I guess, or like you have like light and dark, like
yes. So we have like really rich color, especially in the sky. So we've got those really luminous yellows and oranges and reds. They're very deep. It doesn't really get like grayish until you start to have it merging with the water, right? So you've got that dramatic lighting, you've got the rich color, right? Anyone else see any other characteristics that feel romantic? How would you describe the brushstroke? How about Isabel Ioka? How would you describe the brushstroke?
It's very feathery, and there's also a lot of like thin ones, like with the ships.
Right. I was able to go to Boston a couple of years ago and I saw this painting, and it's almost like the paint is like scratched across the surface in places. It's very expressive. You see a lots of brushstroke as he was almost painting it. It felt like he was painting it quickly and very emotionally, right? So with this, right, keep in mind, sorry, I should have had this loaded, is that he was painting from his imagination. He was not there, right? He was just reading about this in the newspaper. And so he was painting it from his imagination. And the subject matter is based on contemporary events, but also look at the power of nature, right? That's our theme for today, is man's relationship with nature. It's almost like nature is trying to right the wrongs of man, right? The wrongs of man is enslaving people, right? And then also, not only is it enslaving people, but like when disease happens, let's throw people overboard so that we can reap our insurance money rather than, lose money, right? And so we talked about the color, we talked about the brushstroke. There are some dramatic diagonals in the arms and the legs coming out of the water, in the ship as it kind of moves across, right? And so how does it reflect its time and place? It was contemporary newsworthy events, right? So here up close, you can kind of see fishes devouring the dead bodies. This is a foot poking under the water, right? This is another Turner. Can you guys tell what the subject matter is for this one? It's a steam engine. You guys see the steam engine? And so it's almost like the weather is created by the steam coming from this train. Turner was a major influence on the Impressionists. So people like Monet, right, were influenced by the work of Turner because it's light, it's color, it's effects of weather and atmosphere and how we perceive reality, right? And also kind of shows motion because the trains are moving so fast, there would be blur. We do have the invention of photography during this time, and so we'll focus on that. I think we're going to start on Monday, if I remember right. So thinking about Turner's style, right? Turner's style is, what's a running characteristic that you guys see? What's a running characteristic of Turner? How can you pinpoint a Turner painting? I've gotten everyone to talk. Can't pick on anyone anymore. Right? The power of nature, right? It's all about these this stormy sort of skies, either man-made or by nature. Right. This is Constable, John Constable. He was a British painter. He was really known for his romantic scenes. They're basically anti-industrialization and anti-city living. So a lot of people at this time thought of city life as really ugly, right? You mass produce a chair, you mass produce a bowl. Things are losing that kind of personal touch. And so he was saying, if we move back to an agrarian lifestyle, we go back to Gothic times, it would be just very, like, life would be much more beautiful. And so you see a lot of reminiscent paintings of better days. So here, this is actually British Gothic, right? That perpendicular style we talked about yesterday. Notice how low the church is, but how tall the steeple is. And of course, better days, always better days with a rainbow, right? This is a French painter, Daubigny, and he was a part of a series of French painters who started to go outside to paint. And they too influenced the Impressionists, who often painted outdoors. Okay, so our last two works have a very similar function. So we have the Oxbow by Thomas Cole, and we have the Valley of Mexico by Jose Maria Velasco. And so focusing on what they have in common, right? Notice the large skies, right? But also notice the landscape, right? Notice the landscape. These scenes are patriotic, right? So we use landscape to represent our patriotism. So our last two pieces are going to have that in common, right? So we'll watch one video to leave today, but let's go ahead and look at the Oxbow first, right? The Oxbow by Thomas Cole. So the Oxbow is a river in Massachusetts that kind of has a switchback, right? So you can see how it turns. And so Cole was studying up on a writer named Orem. And so he was trying to show people that if you did X, Y, and Z, you could elevate landscape to the status of history painting. So what can you do? So he said, if you organize the composition this way, if you use the colors this way, you're going to be able to bring dignity and honor to landscape painting, right? So what Cole did is he layered the space, right? He layered the space to give dignity and honor to this landscape. So let's break it apart into foreground, middle ground, and background again. If we had more time, I'd put you guys in your groups, but we don't. What's in the foreground here? What's in the foreground? What's in the very front? I'll give you a hint. It's on the left side. Varun, can you help me?
It's like the tree and the little knoll.
Right.
That's like in the front of the whatever is in the background.
Right. So there is, we're on a hillside overlooking a valley, and we have this tree here. Now, does the tree look like it's in good health? No, not at all, right? And so it's basically looks like it's maybe been struck by lightning, or maybe it's just fallen and deteriorated apart. And then in the middle ground, right, we've got the flat valley and the river. And then in the background, we have Purple Mountain's Majesty. And actually, if we go back to this slide here, I actually play America the Beautiful, right? So, you know, some of the famous patriotic songs were written during this time or before. And so they kind of describe the beauty of the country that we live in, right? So Cole was showing that. So what he did is on the left, he showed how powerful nature is, how rugged nature is, how forceful it is, how unpredictable. So we have a storm, right? So there's a storm on the left side, and you can see how man can't really control the storm, can't really control nature. It's on the left side. So often people are view this as like the rugged West. Thinking about the American frontier, often people see this as symbolic of the American frontier on the left, right? Which would be in the western part of the United States, right? We have a blasted tree on the left side, and this is a symbol of the power of nature. On the right side, right, we have man conquering nature, right? So in the valley, it's very tranquil, and we can see what happens when man plants in the earth. So we see farmland, right? We see crops. We see there's buildings back here with smoke coming out of them. So we can actually see little houses. So there's a video with this one too. We're not going to watch it, but you're welcome to look at the video. Okay. So in the foreground too, there is the artist working. So the artist went on location and he paints himself there, kind of like staking his claim and looking at this peaceful valley. There he is, right? And so what are some of the major political and philosophical themes reflected? Partially manifest destiny. So I was just talking about the left is kind of this idea of the Wild West and this idea of conquering the unknown, conquering, that we should expand our country, right? Kind of the balance of industrialization and natural beauty, right? Industrialization is more agricultural here, but we can see how we're transforming the landscape for crops. Transcendentalism, maybe a little bit early in this painting, but a lot of people kind of see themes of that as well. Power of nature, right? With the storm, with the tree, right? So that is Oxbow. Here's some other examples of Thomas Cole. He did a lot of historyism paintings as well, but he did a lot of, he's from like New England. So he painted beautiful landscapes of New England. So this is Niagara Falls in, New York and then in Canada. Okay, the last painting that we are going to go over today is the Valley of Mexico from the hillside of Santa Isabel by Jose Maria Velasco. So we're going to be focusing on how it's more than a landscape, right? How is this painting more than a landscape?
In the National Museum of Art in Mexico City, and we're looking at an amazing, very large canvas by Jose Maria Velasco. It is this panoramic image of the Valley of Mexico. The painting is about the land and about the history of the land. In the center and slightly to the right, we see Mexico City itself. It can be barely seen, but it's clear enough so that we can just make out the towers of the Cathedral of Mexico City. Jose Maria Velasco is using light and shadow to guide our eye in this wonderful zigzag motion so that we recede from the foreground all the way into the back to the city itself. So let's talk about how we get there. In the very foreground, we have this incredible specificity, and this is an artist who's known to take real care with botanical and meteorological phenomena. So he's studying plants, he's studying the geology, and he's studying cloud formations, trying to get this right. But our eye first lands on this little vignette of a mother and two children who seem to be walking away from the city, walking back into nature. There's this dramatic shadow that starts in the bottom right-hand corner that arches its way across the foreground, but that helps lead our eye around the light so that we go around this foreground precipice. And then we begin to find our way to the middle ground to where we first see structures that are associated with the hill of Tepeyac, where the Basilica to the Virgin of Guadalupe is, where she miraculously appeared to Juan Diego in 1531. It's one of the great spiritual moments and one of the great spiritual places in Mexico. So this painting is in some ways a celebration of great moments in Mexican history and its spiritual roots. And then beyond that, we're seeing roads that are part of the ancient Aztec causeway that lead us to the heart of Mexico City. And we see some of the effects of industrialization, but only hints of it. Dust maybe being kicked up by machinery or by carriages. All of this is set against the receding lake. A lake that had once surrounded the city that we see in the distance when it was the Aztec capital, but is now being pushed off by increasing development. And so we see this transitory moment, not only in terms of human development, but also in terms of the formations of the sky. We see clouds, we see a rainstorm off to the right that beautifully balance the two volcanic peaks that we see on the left. And those volcanic peaks are important to the history of Mexico. They are the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, thought to have been related to two individuals, two lovers from the Aztec period, so they were important in the mytho-history of Mexico. So even as this is a celebration of Mexico, its present, its history, its mythology, it's also very much a painting of the 19th century. This is a painting that is deeply informed by the romanticism of people like John Constable in England or Caspar David Friedrich in Germany. This is an international movement that is looking back to nature in all of its grandeur, the way in which it can evoke a spiritual power, but at a historical moment that is interested in the scientific. And I think that's where it begins to depart more from those romantic qualities of the landscape. Jose Maria Velasco
Velasco was interested in the scientific observation of nature to try to make it as exact as possible. So he's painting this as a member of the Academy of San Carlos, this academic institution here in Mexico City. And his teacher is actually an Italian immigrant who is training and teaching landscape painting.
One of the techniques that the artist uses is to paint this in a studio so that he can get the exact detail that he wants in a controlled circumstance, but to base the painting on numerous sketches that he does in the landscape. And we're fortunate to have some of the sketches that he produced while hiking in these mountains.
And this is one of numerous paintings that the artist completed that show the Valley of Mexico from this perspective. And in fact, as we stand in the gallery, we can see some of these other paintings, including another from almost the same vantage point, but in this one from a slightly different angle, a bit higher up, but we don't have any human figures.
Instead, in the foreground, we see an eagle that seems to have just flown off a cactus. And in Mexico, this is potent imagery.
It could just be an eagle flying off a cactus, but for Mexican history, this is related to the Aztec migration story, where they ended up establishing their capital city of Tenochtitlan, or modern-day Mexico City, on an island in the middle of the lake after they saw an eagle perched atop a cactus.
And this symbol is a central emblem of the Mexican flag, can be found on Mexican currency, and remains an important way in which modern Mexico ties itself back to its Aztec origins.
And so how we can understand these paintings by José María Velasco is in part due to this increasing urgency for a Mexican national identity that has been ongoing since independence in 1821.
Okay, so the last statement that she just made is probably one of the most important, right? And maybe just like a really core answer to how it's more than just a landscape, right? Is that it's a symbol of national pride, right? Just like the Oxbow symbolizes, American conquering of nature, going into like hard lands and being able to cultivate nature to bring prosperity, right? This scene really does echo Mexican nationalism as well as history and mythology, right? So it's got a lot of elements of it, right? So this is done after the 1821 War of Independence. It was done he studied at the Royal Academy of San Carlos, which was actually the first art academy of the Americas. So it happened in Mexico City rather than in North America. And they modeled their paintings after what was going on in a previous generation in Europe. So focusing once again, we saw this in the video, but what's in the foreground, middle ground, background, right? In the foreground, we have kind of the peasants, right? The peasants kind of leaving the city, right? To kind of return to the land, right? To relearn to the fruitful land of Mexico, right? So you see how rugged nature is in the foreground, right? And then in the middle ground, we have Lake Titicaca, right? We have the lake that surrounds Mexico City, right? And we have Mexico City itself. So Mexico City is right here. And then we know Mexico City once was surrounded by that lake, right? Because it's an island, but we can see how it's receding back by consumption as well as contemporary practices to drain the lake. And then you can see the mountains and the volcanoes in the distance, right? And so these things represent, mythology with the volcanoes, with the sacred location of where the Virgin of Guadalupe was sighted, right? We have, this contemporary person in the foreground, all of them kind of echoing what we know about the people of Mexico. So foreground. Here we go. Here we get the spellings for ourselves in the middle ground. Supposedly the artist also lived on that hillside where Juan Diego saw the Virgin of Guadalupe. And then we have those Aztec lovers in the volcanoes. Other Velasco paintings. This is a Velasco here, but you can sort of see how he was influenced by Frederick. Okay, that is all we have for today.